my goal for this session, I tried to come up with sort of 3 goals. One is I wanted to make PowerCLI not be threatening. Right? It's pretty simple language, so I want to make you feel comfortable with it. Secondly, I wanted to make sure that you had a really good foundation for understanding how it works. We're going to go through some examples, and then give you the tools so that you can dig deeper. And then if you want to automate some reports, put some scripts together, that you know where to go for that. So, just a quick question. How many people here have already used PowerCLI? All right, that's almost half the room. How many of you have never seen PowerCLI at all before? Just heard it. All right, so my challenge is to really balance this. Right? I'm trying to make it interesting for those of you that have used PowerCLI a little bit, but I also need to balance this for those that this is supposed to be a primer. So if you've never seen PowerCLI, even if you really don't know how to script, we're going to kind of start some of the foundations. I really want to make this interactive, so feel free to ask questions, because this can be scripting, it could be a dry subject. All right, so let's try it. We're going to try to have fun with this. Feel free to ask a question anytime. All right, so here's the agenda. We're going to start with an introduction to PowerShell, just real quickly. What is PowerShell? All right, and some of the basics, so that once you get in PowerShell, you understand how it works. And I'm going to teach you just the absolute least amount you need to know about the semantics, how to get PowerShell to move forward. Then we're going to start with PowerCLI, some basic commands. And then what I've pretty much heard from my customers are the 2 most common use cases are creating reports, because it's very simple to do that, and automating tasks. So that's kind of how I focus this, to go through some examples of creating reports and tasks. And then I thought long and hard, what's the best way with maybe 75 people in the room? How do I teach, or how do I come across a topic and talk about PowerShell, PowerCLI, try to make it interesting? So this is my only slide. All right, because I really didn't think there was any possible way to talk about PowerShell just in PowerPoint. So I'm going to bring up, and I actually have PowerShell running. For those of you in the back, I tested this earlier today. You can see it well up to about 3/4 back in the room. So if you have any trouble seeing, you might want to move up. There's plenty of seats. All right, so I'll set this up. Any questions before I begin? So, starting with PowerShell. Just real quickly, PowerShell is Microsoft's interactive shell that they came out with. It was first released, actually first demonstrated in 2003. It took them about 3 more years before it was released in 2006. And the latest version, that was PowerShell 1. PowerShell 2 came out in 2009. And if you've ever used Windows 7, Windows 2008 R2, it's built in. It's part of Windows today. So I'm going to start with, and for those of you that have a pen with you, the idea of the handout that I put together was that since I'm just going to go through on the screen, feel free to follow along. I'm going to kind of go through those concepts if you want to take any notes. If something doesn't make sense to you. So just to start with, how you interact with PowerShell. Most of the time you're using commandlets. And what commandlets are, they're usually designed and written in such a way that it's a verb noun. So the first example I'm going to do is get date. So commandlets usually have a verb in front, a hyphen, and then a noun. So they're very self-descriptive. So very simply, get date, pops back what's going on. Another example, get process. For those of you that have used Linux, right, this would be just like PS, get the process list, and pops it back the information. All right, so commandlets are real easy. An important commandlet to know is get command, right? And this is listed in the handout. This will give you a list of all of the commandlets in there. So at any point in time, you'd like to know what commands there are. As you saw go through, there are a lot of them. All right, so first step, commandlets. Second of which is how we interact with it. So we're going to add some parameters and arguments after the command. That's how we work. So I'm going to do some quick examples. And one thing I'm going to do, probably move a little quicker here, is use tab completion. So tab completion is your friend with PowerShell. Right after you hit the dash and start typing, it's very quick. So many times with parameters, there's just a dash, and you type in, for here, I want to format the date differently. So we saw before, get date, I'm going to change the format now. And these formats are listed on Microsoft's site. I didn't publish all the details of how to get the formats. So dash format M gives me a different type of date. We can also use, going back to our simple example of get process. If I want to, we'll see that list here. If I want to see just one of them, SVC host, right, with run services, one of the parameters for this is dash name SVC. Right, it's that simple. One common thing you'll see in the examples here is that PowerShell allows you to skip the most common parameters. So if you just kind of don't use the dash to finding exactly which parameter you want, it's going to assume a certain one. So that name one is assumed by default. So sometimes you'll see a commandlet without a dash in front of that parameter. It's just an argument, and it makes an assumption. All right, so again, I'm just going to the real basics, so that none of this syntax looks confusing as we jump in. So let's talk about variables real quick. Variables are an important part of any scripting language. I'm going to switch up my format now for use format M again. So if I want to use a variable, I don't, in PowerShell, it's very simple. I don't have to define it beforehand. I just put a $sign in front of it, and I can just use it. So if I want to save month, date, type in the same command I had before. All right, so that's just assigned it as a variable. We can actually get the output just by putting on the command line. So real simple. Variables are great for storing information, kind of a key stepping stone. All right, so the last real semantic item we're going to talk about before we dive into PowerCLI, and it's really important, is pipelines. So I'm sure most of you, at some point in time, if you've used a Windows system or if you've ever done DIR and you've piped something, which is that little bracket, you know, it might be hard to see here, to more. And essentially, you've taken the output of DIR, if you want to tab file or type file, you get to look at it by page. The one thing that's very unique about PowerShell, and it's different from almost any of those other languages, is that it doesn't take just text and put it through the pipe process. So again, for any of you that have used Linux and very familiar where you're using pipe, many times you have to try to find information, you might need to use grep or awk to try to find those specific variables. That's actually not necessary here. PowerShell passes objects. And that makes, and we'll kind of go into more detail about how that works, but this is built on .NET. Whether you don't need to know anything about .NET, the fact is it uses objects and makes our lives a lot easier. We're going to go through a couple examples. So I just typed DIR, looking at the file system. An example here of a pipe. I'm going to send it to another common commandlet. And again, I've referenced these in the handout, sort object. So by default, it sorts it by name. And one thing to note here, we're able to do this because this is an object. Right? We're not just taking streams of text and playing around with it here. So what this means is I actually have some flexibility. I'm going to change my example here now to get process. And let's say I'd like to sort the process list. By default, it's going to go by name. I think it's actually already shown us that, so I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to choose now to sort by ID. All right, so just two commands, very simple. So I've got this object, it's able to realize, hey, there's a property here in this object which is ID, and I can sort by that. Another example might be CPU. And I just want to introduce one other parameter here, because it's used very often when you're sorting. Maybe I want to see what's using the most CPU, so I want to sort in descending order. So I'll throw a parameter on there for descending, and it turns around. All right, so very simply, going through variables, commandlets, pipelines, properties. Those are the 4 items you need to know to get started. Any questions so far? So for those of you that are more advanced, at the end of each of these topics, I'm going to throw in a couple of advanced topics that if you're just introduction to PowerShell, you don't need to pay too much attention here. But if you understand objects, object-oriented programming, and you want to see more information when I talk about that there's objects here, if I use the select object command and I put a star at the end, I can actually see much more information about get date. And normally when I get date, it just outputs the date. But here I can see all the properties of an object. So what does that mean for me? So let's say I save the get date into a variable D. That means I can reference any of these properties. So I see day is 5. We reference the properties with a dot at the end, so the variable. And I have access to the day. If I want to know what the second is, I can see that as well. So now I'm going to jump into the PowerCLI proper. Really just want to make sure you guys knew the 4 basic fundamentals of PowerShell. So PowerCLI itself is a plug-in to Windows PowerShell. So what we've done in our engineers is taken a number of, or created a number of commandlets. Essentially, commandlets are just .NET objects as well. So when we first released our first PowerCLI, I believe it's called the VI Toolkit, I believe there were less than 100 commandlets. And we've significantly improved them with feedback from users. There's a lot that you can do now with just the commandlets that exist. So the most common command that's run almost all the time when you get in your environment is get VM. All right, so I'm actually running a live environment here. Back in. So the nice thing you can see, yes?
Where did you connect to the vSphere?
So the question was, what host am I connecting to? So for this very simple example, I've got my Mac up here, Fusion running. So I'm running a virtual ESX host, and then a virtual Windows, which is running PowerShell, PowerCLI. So while I can power VMs on, there's not too much they can do because a virtual doesn't function as well.
You ran a connect VI server command on it?
Yes, so I'm going to go back to the connect VI. I just want to go real simply. The question was, did you already run the connect VI command? And that's how you connect to your server, and I'll go into that. But I just want to show some really quick PowerCLI examples. So look, I hit get VM, you got a list of all the virtual machines in the environment. The first thing I want to introduce you to is get VI command. So I mentioned before, get command lists all of the PowerShell commands. Get VI command lists all of the vSphere PowerCLI commands. So there's a poster right up here in the front, and at the end, I've got a bunch of these posters for you guys. So I can hand these out. This is the latest PowerCLI 4.1.1 poster that exists. All right, so it's got almost every single one of our commands along with some examples. So I'm going to go through that quick example of how you connect to your environment to start. All right, so if I'm just in PowerCLI, or I'm just in PowerShell, I use the command connect VI server. And then there are a couple of parameters we can use, but if I just want to simplify it, I can type in the IP address. For those of you that are using Windows authentication and you're on a domain, it will try a single sign-on on your Windows system to your vCenter host, which is why you may see a long delay if you try it the first time in case it times out, comes back, and then will prompt you for your credentials. I haven't even set a root password on my host. Right, and I'm logged in. So now I'm going to run through, yes, question, Frank.
Writing a script, like automated task every night for a report. How can we write a script and not say password,
Okay, so a very good question is, if I automate a script and I'm running it, let's say once a night, how do I make sure I don't put in the script plain text, the username and password? So there is a way to save credentials and restore credentials. The process is a little bit complex, so I didn't actually include it in the example here today. If you go and you Google for saving credentials or caching credentials, it'll come right up with an example. So absolutely. And then, but the important thing to know is those credentials are encrypted and they'll sit in a file. That file can be reversed. Right? Anyone who has access to that file, since it's just a hash, could reverse it and get access to the credentials. So make sure where you store that file is secure. Anyone who has access to that file could use the command, right, to essentially resume those or import those credentials and access your system. If you're running a report, I highly recommend you create a user in vCenter that's read-only, that they can't do whatever, wouldn't be any malicious action. Worst case, it would lose compliance. All right, so I'm going to go through some quick examples on how, we're really going to do with just a couple lines, I mean not a couple lines, just a couple of characters, really powerful things in PowerShell, PowerCLI. So I did get VM. I'm going to introduce some concepts of it as I go along. We can do some wildcard characters. So if I want to find all of my SQL servers, I know they start with SQL, and then anything afterwards, I can use that. I've just got my SQL servers. Let's say I wanted to start a system. I mentioned before the pipe command. Right, so the pipe command is very, very useful and used almost all the time in PowerCLI. So right now I've written get VM. I want to get that SQL system, SQL 01, and then I can pipe it to any number of commandlets that perform actions. So I mentioned before, commandlets are usually a verb noun. You'll see a lot of get commands. You'll also see in PowerCLI set commands, new commands, and remove commands. So it might be like new hard disk, remove hard disk, set VM to change parameters. In this specific example, there's one called start VM. So with just that two commandlets, the get VM, SQL, pipe it, start VM, it's that simple. I started. If I want to stop the system, I can use the pipe to pass that same VM object to the stop VM command. Now you'll notice it comes up with a warning, and you'll get this for a number of commandlets that have the potential to make significant changes. We're going to by default warn you to try to stop the system, to try to delete items. All right, so I'm going to take the default and say yes. Well, let's say I'm running a script, I want to automate it. How do I get rid of that, that flag or that confirmation? So I'm going to go back and start my system. And I've written in the handout, we just use a parameter called confirm and pass it false, which is a built-in variable with a dollar sign in front of it. So I want to not confirm the process. You can use this for any commandlets that will stop you with that confirmation dialog. You'll notice this time, it doesn't ask me. So that's really important. Make sure you test it out before you start doing that. You could hit get VM and type it to remove VM and delete your entire environment. Right, so anything to do with scripting can be very powerful, and that's why we built in that confirmation process. All right, so let's go a little bit deeper. So I know I can get a VM. What do I want to see more information about it, right? So get VM SQL 1 shows me the name, its power state, CPU's memory. What do I want to find out about its storage configuration? So I can send that to additional commands, like get hard disk. Now I get information about all of the disks that exist. Right? This is a very simple environment on my laptop. So it's just one okay. I want to see information about the network. There's a similar PowerShell command to that as well. Get network adapter. And it shows me the VNIC. One that I just wanted to point out, because one of my customers used this script because they found that sometimes users would attach CD drives and leave them connected. So there's nothing hooked up here, but you can very quickly look at all the CD drives across all of the VMs. I don't remember if I added that in my environment. I did not. And you can see whether they're connected or not.
Can you only connect this to a host, or can you connect to vCenter with this so you can see your whole environment?
The question was, can you connect just to a host or to vCenter? Absolutely, I would recommend connecting to vCenter so you can access to your entire environment. In this very simple lab on my laptop here, I just connected to a host. I didn't want to run a third VM to try to run vCenter as well. So it is flexible enough that you can connect directly to a host. So an important question to make, you guys might be thinking about, is what about the free ESXi? If I can connect right to a host, what can I automate here? So it is important to note that free ESXi, all of the web services APIs are set to read only. So you can use PowerShell for free ESXi, but if you try to automate commands, it does require licensing to do that. So you'll get like an error back that says not licensed. All right, so I'm going to make changes to a couple VMs. All right, so this wasn't done on purpose, but I'll show you. If you make a mistake typing commands, you're going to get a lot of angry red responses. And it's not always that intuitive what's going on. So I believe I intended to go through an example, but I haven't. I'm going to go through it now. Going for help with information. So I get some error back. What am I doing wrong? There's a very important commandment called get help. And if you want help on any commands, you just add the commandment afterwards. So type get help or get VM command. And there's a lot of information there. It'll show me all of the proper information, right? What parameters I use. And then there's two other important parameters to know about for get help. Right? For whatever reason, it always does a short help. You can use -detailed, which will give you information about every single parameter. If you just want the examples, you can do get help -example. And we'll just show you examples. So definitely an important command to know, and again, that's in the handout. So I am going to get a VM that I call vCenter. And I set this here with only one virtual CPU and 512 meg RAM. Well, that's not the best practices. So let's say we wanted to add processors, change the RAM. How would we go about doing that? Well, for one thing, I'm going to make my life a little bit easier, and I'm going to put the virtual machine as an object in the variable. So I'm going to put $VC, that's my vCenter VM, in the variable. And now I'm going to use a new command, setVM. So setVM will actually change a lot of parameters. So I'm going to use setVM the VM I want to make changes on, which is my variable PC, and then what I want to do. I want to change the number of CPUs to 2. Again, this is one that asks for confirmation. And that's it. It's just as easy if I want to change memory. And if you're not quite sure exactly the parameter, you can start it. Tab complete is very helpful. It's in megabytes, so I'll do 2048, 2 gig. Again, for confirmation. And that's all you have to do. And this command itself, very short. Right, PowerCLI is very powerful. You don't actually have to type a long command. Because these commandlets are named very easy to understand, once you know a few commandlets, you can build upon your knowledge and very easily start writing some scripts. All right, so I'm just going to go through a couple more examples to show you. Let's say I wanted to add a hard drive, this vCenter VM. Let's say it needs another disk. So I'm going to use the new hard drive commandlet, just give it the virtual center. You can do this and it would work. For my simple example, and the fact that I'm running on a laptop, I can't take the default capacity. So I'm just creating with a 1 gig drive because I believe it defaults to 4 gig and I'll run out of space. So one thing to note though, in the command, notice how it says capacity KB. That means the capacity is in kilobytes. I'm not sure exactly why they do this, probably because you can't go less than kilobytes. But then you have to make sure you think when you put the number on the end, I'm using a shorthand. We're actually able to do 1 MB, 1 megabyte, but I need to know that goes up to 1 gigabyte. So if I want to see information about the network adapter on my virtual center VM, I've got one. Let's say I want to add another one. I happen to create another network called DMZ. Well, you probably never want to put your virtual center on the DMZ network. Let's just use that as an example. So I'm just going to start with it. I'm kind of changing the way we go through these commands to show that there's different ways to go about it. I can just take the variable, which is the virtual machine, and just pipe it right into the command. So I'm going to use new network adapter. These, and let's do it this way. There are a few commands that do not accept typed variables, and I think the network adapter is not the one. If you try doing it, you'll get those angry red letters back at you. So I'm going to add it to the DMZ network. Pound sign instead of a dollar sign. Thanks for catching that. And you will see one thing it's really good at. When you get an error, it will tell you where exactly they're trouble parsing. So right after where it was looking for what VM. So now I've added the DMZ network, and I go back to my get network adapter. I can see I've got 2 of them.
Hey, Aaron.
Yes.
So you created the local variable name VC. Is there any way, if you wanted to save that, you're going to use it constantly over and over and over? Is there a way to do that, or do you have to reinvent the wheel every time you log into vCLI?
The question is, can I save a variable between when I enter a session of PowerCLI and when I exit? Is that
Yes.
good?
Yes.
I don't believe so. I think the best way to do it would be just to write a script. Okay. Yeah. So it's a more complex. Since if you log in and you have a profile, you could potentially go about doing that. But then again, the profile would have to probably want to log you in because get VM's not going to do anything unless you're connected to your vSphere. Question?
Is there a reason you don't have MAC address?
The question, the reason why I don't have a MAC address? I do not know. I think think it's because, oh, yes, this is done on a virtual ESX host, and it's given, the VM that's the virtual ESX has one physical NIC that's assigned to the first vSwitch. I created a new vSwitch, but I didn't give the virtual ESX host a second NIC to connect it to. So since it's a vSwitch without a physical NIC, it won't assign that to us. This was just built for an example. So the last one I'll show real quick and then move on to the next section. We can create snapshots as well. Just again, almost all these commands are put in commandlets. So for some of the commandlets, and the example I want to show here is if you don't include enough information, like the new snapshot command needs to know what's the name of your snapshot. Some of these are smart enough to prompt you. So it's an interactive command. I can say, and we'll go and create a snapshot. Now, I don't think we've used any real complex pipe commands, but I do want to show that you can just keep piping information all the way through. I start with get VM, which comes back with a collection of objects of all the virtual machines. I send it to get snapshot. What I'm left with is not virtual machines anymore, just the snapshot objects. I could send that to remove snapshot and just keep going down the pipe, right? I keep picking what type of objects I want to do work on. Now, a command like this in a production environment, right, you have the ability to, you're going to clean up those snapshots. You can clean up every snapshot that's out there. One last thing I'll show. It is important to as we start moving to the next section is, all right, so we've gone through some basic commands. There's a lot of get commands for information. You can do set commands. But at some point, we're going to start getting down and filtering. How do we start filtering this information so I can do specific work, right? This is a great example, but it's 6 VMs. You've got hundreds. How do I do some of that work? Well, one thing I can do is I can sort. We used a select object once before, but a common example of select object, you can use a parameter called first. You pull out the first one in the list. So if you end up sorting something, you want the biggest system or the smallest system, right? We want to sort by number of CPUs. So, any questions on this? Is there any other commands you guys want to see? Jump into section 3, actually go through some examples of how to create reports and start filtering results. All right, so I've heard at least the most common use case for PowerCLI is creating reports. How do I find information in my environment? The one example I gave where the CD-ROMs were connected. How can I quickly, if I don't have scripting, that means I would have to go to GUI and look at the system. Right? How do I find information quickly? All right, so I'm going to go through a couple examples. There's a lot you can do with filtering. In the handout, I talked about how you can use some wildcards, the star, the question mark. You can start filtering objects with sorting and select object first. Right, so I just did an example. There's a really important commandlet. And again, I'm trying to get a lot done in just a few minutes. I want to spend a little bit on where object. This is probably the most powerful sorting commandlet. It can be very complex to try to use, but we're going to go through a few examples and make this look real simple, or as simple as we can. So now I want to filter down my list of VMs, and I'm going to use the where object. we're going to introduce for the first time these little curly braces. They're used. And something that when I first started in PowerShell really confused me, and that's the $_ variable, if you've ever seen that. So I'm going to try to explain that very simply. In this example where we're listing all the virtual machines, and we're saying where, we're doing sort of a comparison, the $_ is the object you started with, so it could be any virtual machine. So if I did get hard disk, the $_ would be those lists of hard disks, going one by one in the comparison. So it's my current object. This is a built-in variable in PowerShell, which you'll see a lot. So in my example, I'm going to say, I want to get all of my virtual machines where the number of virtual CPUs are 2. There's a couple of key commands you can use, and I list those out there. The where object, you can use -EQ for equals. You may be used to in many of the programming languages having like equals or $ equals for not equals. For whatever reason, and using less than, actually using the less than sign. They decided because you might have to do with HTML or XML, and in fact they use brackets, to go with this new list of commands. So this is just a subset. There's actually a lot more comparison commands. But I'm just going to use a simple example of where CPUs equal 2. Right, and that's all I have to do. GT is for greater than, so I could say greater than 1, or it's going to give me the same example. What if I want to look at memory, large VMs? So we'll go back to my example and say, where the memory is over 1 gig. All right, I can do that as well. Or I want to see which ones are really big VMs. It's all relative. In this example, it's my local database. What if I want to get more complex? What if I want to say, I want to find big VMs, large number of virtual CPUs, and amount of RAM. So we can do that as well. So I'm going to go back to my example. What we use is there's a -and and a -or, which you can combine in any way, shape, or form you like. So now I want to look for So I want to look for VMs where the number of CPUs are greater than 1, and the memory is greater than 2048. It only comes back to one system. I want to make sure I catch that other one, which is my virtual center. So it's just down to 1024. Catch those. All right, so this is a very powerful commandment. It can be kind of intimidating to go through the syntax, especially since PowerCLI syntax doesn't look like anything else. If you've ever spent time in one language and then you move to the next language, you know exactly what you want to do. You know, just greater than, less than, but how do you do the syntax? That's why I built this handout. It's probably you know what you want to do, but you want to not sure of the exact syntax. So I've got tons of examples here, so you can very quickly put together what you'd like to do. Try to pull off the environment.
Does that have visibility to performance objects as well? Like you can say, show me all the ends of slots in 24 hours, things like that. Does that all that?
Yeah, so the question is, does this have any visibility to performance statistics, or like my VM swap? Absolutely. In this example, I kept it really simple. There are some metrics and stats that you can pull, and it starts getting kind of complicated because the VMware environment, Virtual Center is built up. It's also a .NET-based solution, and it has entire object collection. The commandlets simplify. You can talk in commands in ways that we understand, like set VM, get VM, get statistic. If you want to do any of the more complicated web service APIs, you have to understand how we wrote the solution. So some of those with statistics start to go there, where you have to kind of understand how it's written. And there's a lot of great information. There's a book at the end here, the PowerCLI book, which has a lot more depth. The last page of the handout has where I recommend you go for more information. There's a PowerCLI book, the first one there, which is actually a PowerShell book, which I swear by, which is PowerShell generic. There's been a handful of now PowerCLI books that VMware folks have written. So one last reporting example I'll do. And again, I'm just going to kind of combine some of the techniques I've talked about already. Is what do we want to define data stores with the least free space? All right, so how do we build that? So we would start with get data store. We probably want to sort on free space. I believe it's right down. Now, granted, I have one data store in my example. If we have a number of data stores, we can sort by free space. And then again, we can move along and say, you select object to say, I only want to see the top 5. And that's how we pretty much start building reports. We do our query for information. We start filtering down. We've got a lot of mechanisms to do that. Sort, select object, where object. And then it's probably too much to go through the examples here. In the handout, we'll talk about, all right, I've got the report. How do I get it off this system? I just can't show anybody here. So how we can export it. You can export it in CSV, so you can import it in Excel. You can export it to HTML. I actually have an example here of how you can email. So there's a great, I'm not sure if this command is new. It might be new in PowerShell 2. It's called send mail message. So once you have a file sitting in your system, you can use send mail message, and you can point it to an attachment and send an email out. So you can automatically send a report and publish. So like, and I do have customers doing this, besides email, they export to HTML, and then they copy it to the web server. So there's a public website, right, where you can get the latest report. All right, so this provides all the fundamentals. All right, it all starts with doing that first query, using pipe to other command lists to start filtering, narrowing down what you're looking for, and then exporting it to either files or HTML. I will warn you, the example I gave you, the convert to HTML commandlet, it results in pretty ugly output. It is technically HTML. So if you'd like to make something look a little nicer, just Google for PowerShell HTML output. And there are lots of folks that have put together an append to HTML to pretty up with a number of different HTML tags in there that look pretty nice. Question?
Easy way to use the snapshot.
So easy way to do it. So the question is, how do we see VMs that have snapshots? So I deleted my one snapshots and then created a new one. So the way I would start is get VM is great for pulling the entire environment, and I want to filter for get snapshot. What are the other advanced items? So you see snapshot doesn't really give you that much information here. It is important to note that there is more information behind what you see on the screen. There are essentially .NET objects that represent how VMware represents snapshots. We use one of our advanced commands, select object. We can see that there's more information back there. All right, this is getting a little bit advanced, but we actually have the ability to start using some of the commands where it's the ID and how vCenter tracks all the snapshot, all the information. And then there was one other thing I did want to show. If you want some more advanced techniques, get member, because this is an object-oriented based system, will show you essentially, I did this on get VM. We just saw those 4 items where it looked like a little column text. Behind the scenes, each VM is an object. It's got methods, which are ways to act on the object, and then all the properties. I just wanted to stay simple. This is how you can build on it.